what was going on in Gaza, tragic post-humanism. So, well, we've been handling this genocide in so many different ways, and it's over 2,000 years now. I mean, 2,000. It's over 2 months now. It's bombing and killing of the Palestinian have been going on. So I just read an article in International Policy Digest by Professor David Schultz. He brought a new ideas, a new way of looking at this. Is trying to kind of see if the Israelis have a legal basis for the genocide that has been committing there in Gaza. And I don't know if any law can justify or give anybody or any state the right to destroy a nation or a city. It's not about Hamas. It's about destroying the city, destroying the living share of that city, building hospital, school, library, court, land, any living aspect. It was destroyed, and it's been destroyed, and it's been supported by the Americans and the European. The American with sophisticated weapons, and weapon is not even available to the to the American army. I don't know what that necessary, that overkill reaction of the Israelis is madness, is monstrous. I'm not defending Hamas here, and I'm just saying destroying a whole city so you catch a few hundreds hostage or fight a few hundreds or few thousands Hamas militant.
Dr. Schultz, professor of political science at Hamlin University, he wrote up, a very insightful piece at, the International Policy Digest about the questions of the questionable questions of the international law that the Israelis used, trying to use as their basis or to justify their genocide in Gaza. An elaborate article talking about how could you wage a war against non-state or non-governmental issue, with the difference between if Gaza is a state or non-state, or Hamas is just a group of people. And you went on a very diligent about all of this, but the thing is, if there any law whatsoever can justify what the Israelis doing to the in Gaza and to the people of Gaza, almost over 20,000 dead, destroying everything, livelihood, everything. Is there any law whatsoever can justify a country that go and destroy another nation, beheading another nation for just a basis of some kind of a legal explanation or whatever the case might be? So how did you approach that from a legal perspective?
Okay, so keep in mind again, I am a law professor and I teach international law. So what struck me is that in the 2 months since everything has started, no one has really asked the question, how do you approach this issue from an international law perspective? And what I sort of started off with, it's almost like a decision tree, if you know what I mean. Like if it's one thing, do one thing. If it's another thing, another thing. And I started off by saying that that we have to sort of ask. I think the most important question here is what happened initially regarding Hamas and Israel. How do we treat that as an event? And what I said is that if in fact Gaza is part of Israel, if Gaza is still under control of Israel, then you view this as what? A criminal act. And what you do is to say, okay, we've got people who we think may have committed criminal acts, and certainly nobody's going to justify and say that killing people should ever be justified. And what Israel should have done is brought out its police, investigated the crimes, arrested people, put them on trial, and let the criminal justice process do its job. Okay. It opted not to do that. And this is where it becomes an interesting question, because Netanyahu and Israel declared war on Hamas. And this is where I start off by saying that under international law, a state can only declare war against another state. As far as I know, Hamas is not a state. But what becomes really interesting here is 138 member states of the United Nations consider Palestine to be an independent state. Israel and the United States do not. And right off the bat, I thought, well, if Israel is declaring war against Hamas or Gaza, aren't they effectively recognizing its independence as a state? So that becomes sort of one perplexity. But what I'm also trying to get at here is from an international law perspective. Even if we treat Palestine, Gaza as an independent state, although, again, we can question that, there is a lot of limits on what Israel should have been allowed to do. There's, yes, self-defense is okay, but there's concepts about proportionality, that you can't act disproportionately in use of force for self-defense. You also, and I didn't talk about it in the piece, but there are a whole bunch of Geneva Conventions regarding the treatment of non-combatants, treatment of civilians, which get invoked. And there are a whole bunch of other sort of international criminal law questions that are out there. But if we don't treat Gaza as an independent state, instead it's I don't know what it is. It's a Hamas is Hamas is a non-state actor. The International Court of Justice has said already in an advisory opinion, you can't use force against a non-state actor. So the point of my piece was to say, from an international law perspective, there are a lot of problems here. There are a lot of things that should have been done, and it's difficult to justify, if you're looking for it, to justify Israel's action in terms of issues such as the Geneva Convention, the Convention Against Genocide, and a whole bunch of other body of international law that's already out there.
Is Israel a member of any of this international legal apparatus?
Yes, it is. Yeah. It's a member state of the United Nations, and by virtue of being a member state of the United Nations, you recognize the jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice to resolve disputes. And in fact, one of the most basic cornerstones of modern international law is the imperative to try to peacefully resolve disputes. My poor students this semester at Hamlin, I've asked them to repeat 100 times, what's the basic premise of post-World War II international law? And I always tell them what the answer is: peaceful resolution of conflict. Peaceful resolution of conflict. And this is a dispute that could be potentially taken could have been taken to the International Court of Justice. There are possibilities that the International Criminal Court could be involved, although Israel does not recognize the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. But there are tribunals out there that are set up to try to address these manners or these issues growing out of October 7th, if not before, that should have been handled through, again, our framework of bodies of international law that exist out there.
You know, you mentioned also that the Israel violation of international law has a long history. I've never ever, since I was a little kid growing up in Egypt, we're talking about the Resolution 44, Israelis never recognized anything the United Nations came up with as a resolution, peaceful resolution, and violated all sorts of international law. And you alluded to the fact that actually what led to October 7th. All these issues, legal issue, not really what Israelis did after October 7th. Really, we need to deal with all the violation preceding October 7th.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly, and I'm going to admit I'm a pacifist. So understanding that, I'm certainly not going to say that taking up arms against Israel by a group of perhaps terrorists or how we classify Hamas is okay. But having said that, as I pointed out in the piece, there's an incredible amount of political frustration and denial of basic human rights that have occurred building up to October 7th. There is the blockading essentially of Gaza. There is the essentially renunciation of the two-state solution. There is the creation of essentially, I guess I would call it the Israeli version of separate but maybe not equal. That's been going on there. And so one can understand the frustration. I didn't write this in my piece, but let's think about a parallel here, a parallel between perhaps African Americans in the United States and what happened with George Floyd's death or murder that finally becomes the catalyst. We have to look at what's been happening with policing and people of color for many, many years. And maybe there's a parallel there.
You are looking at this in your piece from a legal international law.
Correct.
And can you separate international law from the culture, the human aspect that those laws affects or driven from? Just purely international law, where you need to look at history, culture, because those international law are created by human, are created by history, are created by obviously the people who have power eventually at the end of the day.
Yeah. One of my law school teachers many years ago said something to the effect of, if the law doesn't reflect what we think is our ordinary notions of justice, there's something wrong with the law. And I have always remembered that. And I want to hope, and the theory is that international law is supposed to be reflective of international human rights. It's supposed to be the connective tissue that defines the orderly and peaceful way for how nations and people interact. But unfortunately, as we've seen, that it's oftentimes looks more like what? Reflects the interests of the stronger, or reflects particular biases of particular countries. Think about approximately 48 to 72 hours before we recorded this, there was a resolution before the United Nations Security Council calling on a cessation of violence and basically for a humanitarian ceasefire. The United States, as a permanent member of the Security Council, vetoed that. One would hope that any country that's interested in peace would be looking at what's happening in Gaza right now and say, we have to do something to end the violence there. And this should have been a resolution that should have been supported by the United States, but it was not. And it looks to many people, probably perhaps to many of the people who are viewing this video, is that international law is not reflecting what we think is justice, but it's reflecting what? The interests of the stronger or the more powerful or of a particular set of interests. And that is unfortunately a problem.
You know, I've never seen anybody from this people in power, a powerful actor in the world, global world, like been put on trial, international law. Bush, Major, all the people who lied to us and caused the deaths of millions in Iraq and Afghanistan. And these are the people who talk about human rights and talk about our democracy and Israel is wherever. They talk a lot about peace, but they always in wars. In your article, you talk about there is a legal basis for putting Netanyahu on trial the same way you put Hamas.
Yes, yeah. There is the International Criminal Court, and again, I point out the fact that on one level, Israel does not recognize the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, and therefore it would be difficult, to put Netanyahu before it for trial. But he certainly would be a possible candidate for being put on trial, and if not through the International Criminal Court. Over time, the United Nations has created special tribunals to handle matters like this. For many of us, the most famous takes us back to the 1940s, before the United Nations, the Nuremberg courts, to hold trials here. Or we forget that there was the Tokyo courts also. So there are a variety of mechanisms that are in place or could be in place with Security Council support, UN Security Council support, to hold people criminally responsible for their behavior.
Even if they are not a member or they do not recognize a legal body.
There are ways you can still do that. Yeah. Assume for this, I'll sound like a law professor now. Assume which I am. Okay. So assume that some country invades another country, commits genocide against it. Neither of them are members of the United Nations. And the country committing genocide eventually loses and they arrest, let's say, all their leadership or something. Could we put them on trial for crimes against humanity or for illegal use of aggression? The answer is yes. There are ways that you can hold people accountable.
Isn't that what happened in Yugoslavia?
Exactly. When they were committing genocide there. And we've had countries in Africa where we've had leaders who have basically overseen, crimes against their own people or against let's say neighboring tribes have been put on trial by the International Criminal Court. And so there are ways of doing this. And so let's take it in two different ways here. Again, going back to my original premise here, is that Israel could have opted to say, we've had some crimes committed against us on October 7th. We're going to treat this as a domestic police matter, investigate, arrest, put on trial. Or it could have said, we're going to treat this as a violation of some international criminal law. Again, arrest, put these people on trial before the International Criminal Court. For people like me who want to say that we ought to try to do things more civilized in the world, that would have been the option. And Israel opted not to make that their option. Israel opted to go a different route of declaring war against a people. I mean, unless you can show me something that says Hamas is a state, and it's not. They're declaring war against the people, and that raises troubling questions potentially about genocide and a whole bunch of other perhaps international legal norms.
Well, which the Israelis been doing for years, and I mean they've been uh, arresting Palestinian, put them on trial on the military court. The people in West Bank or anywhere,
Right.
they can go and pick up anybody, arrest anybody, kidnap anybody, and put them on trial in a military court. I mean, there are thousands of Palestinians and Israelis prisoners under accusation of all those sorts of crime, which they haven't even been put on trial with. So they actually been doing this. They've been, putting people, Palestinians, since they are under occupation, so they are under the legal system of Israelis. Also, on an international level, they've been hunting down the Nazi and people who committed crimes in Germany and everywhere and put them on trial. They didn't go and invade Germany for exterminating 6 million Jews. They didn't go and when they are, I mean, Menachem Begin himself, the prime minister of Israel, it was thought after from international, from being put on an international tribunal from the crime that him and his group committed in the 40s. So this is a precedent that people can put on trial instead of this disproportional overkill of destroying a nation because you want to revenge or you want to bring a few hundreds hostage and so on, so on forth. So disproportionately, that is, I like what you put in your piece, reacting in penurity and disproportionately, it's illegal.
It is illegal. It is illegal. Yeah. Like I said, first off, war under international law is illegal. Period. It's supposed to be illegal. Self-defense only as a last resort. You can use it. Self-defense only against another state, not against a people. And self-defense has to be proportional. These are the basic principles of international law. And with that, I should also say one of the other principles, again, in place since 1945, is what's called a repudiation of total war. And what the Nazis did was what? They targeted civilians, they targeted everybody. And what we have now said under a framework of law, again, these are the Geneva Conventions, is that non-combatants, civilians, civilian infrastructure, hospitals, I don't know, grocery stores, you know what I'm getting at here. Those are not military targets. That even if you are at war, you don't target civilians.
I'm amazed how what the Israelis been doing in Gaza over 2 months now.
Yeah.
And all the images and evidence show the destruction, the scale of monstrous act and overreacting and disproportion. And it's been accepted in the mainstream media. It's been accepted from political leaders from England, from Germany, from United States. So I'm assuming those people have advisory that they can tell them about the international law violation of those genocidal acts. Why do they act like we don't care?
That's a really good question here. I mean, I was at the gym this morning on Sunday morning, exercising, watching CNN, and watching footage from Gaza. And I can't help but wondering why other states aren't now trying to, which they can, filing complaints with the International Court of Justice, trying to say that Israel's violating things. Or why isn't there this, at least in the West, an outcry against it. Again, go to the UN, the General Assembly, and the vast majority of the members of the General Assembly, I suspect, if you surveyed them, would be saying that what's going on here is a tragedy, travesty, I should say, that it's destruction, beyond pale. There was a majority of the UN Security Council who was saying the same thing. But what has also struck me, and the reason, again, go back to it, the reason why I did this piece 2 months in, I had yet to see anybody write anything in the mainstream media about how international law, at least in theory, is supposed to bear on this. And it just struck me. It's like, wait a minute. There's this whole framework of law that tells us, at least in theory, how to approach the issues and to give us guidance regarding what's appropriate, what's inappropriate, what should we do. And I feel like as if the mainstream media has largely like, what? There's international law, looking around, and even scholars, and I read things like Foreign Policy magazine. I try to keep my nose in all this stuff, and I have been struck by the lack of discussion of the international law implications of what's been going on, not just since October 7th, but taking us back. And I don't know how many years we have to go back, but taking us back many years.
It's amazing. Really, what you've just said, it's amazing. Because Gaza doesn't have oil, or doesn't have any support, it doesn't have any friends, doesn't have any, is not getting the right attention and support. This is really a human travesty.
Yeah.
And with all this advance that we have in technology and everything now, we're still a long, long way from our human technology and our humanity. And we are in post-humanism now.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess I would say I'm still waiting to see the humanity in our human rights.
Wow. We see a lot of rights, no humanity there.
That's true. That's true.
Well, Dr. Schultz, really appreciate this. I know it's hard, and everybody is sitting on his hands or his asses and just watching this tragedy unfold and given the green lights. If anything, it's not just the Israelis, the rape that's taking place in Gaza, but participating in it, providing the weaponry, providing the cover-up, providing the legal and political. And there is a price for everything. I mean, as what happened to October 7th, I'm not justifying that. There is a history there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to invoke a book. When I was growing up, it was during the Vietnam War. And there was a book called Fire in the Lake by Francis Fitzgerald. And it was about our involvement in Vietnam. And I remember reading it in college. And her conclusion was something along the lines of, you never can bond people into submission. That I thought the lesson of Vietnam was that you drop tons of napalm, tons of bombs upon people. That's never going to produce peace. That's never going to produce equitable settlement. And somehow that book has always stayed with me because, the lesson of Vietnam is that force does not produce friendship. I'm looking at what's happening, especially now in the last 2 months, and thinking, this is going to do nothing to bring peace to the Middle East except perpetuate another 2,000 years of conflict.
And it's not going to even provide any more security for the Israelis.
No.
This is horrible. I know it used to be a PLO. They eliminated PLO, gave them Mercedes and hotel and credit cards and let them sit at home, try to monitor the people in West Bank. Now you have ICE. As a matter of fact, when you talk about Hamas, that was an Israeli creation in the 80s.
Yes.
Counter the PLO, the more secular one.
Mm-hmm.
So you try it, short of justice and fairness, you're not going to have peace in your area. So
I agree.
On that notes, and hopefully it's hopeful notes, Well, thanks so much again, Dr. Schultz, Professor of Political Science at Hamlin University. You wrote up, a very insightful piece at International Policy Digest about the questions of the questionable questions of the international law that Israelis used trying to use as their basis or to justify their genocide